You've been wronged, betrayed, humiliated. And now late at night, you lie awake fantasizing about the perfect revenge. You imagine their face when they realize what you've done. You picture their downfall, their regret, their suffering. For a moment, the fantasy feels delicious, almost intoxicating. But then morning comes, and you're still angry, still hurt, still consumed by thoughts of payback. Welcome to the psychology of revenge, one of humanity's most destructive yet persistent obsessions. Tonight, we're diving deep into the mind of Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher who decoded the hidden psychology behind our thirst for vengeance. He didn't just identify why we crave revenge. He exposed the toxic mechanism that turns victims into perpetrators and shows us why the pursuit of revenge ultimately destroys the person seeking it. But first, let me ask you something. When was the last time you fantasized about getting back at someone who hurt you? When did you last feel that dark satisfaction imagining their comeuppance? If you can't remember, you're either lying to yourself or you're not human. Because the desire for revenge isn't a character flaw. It's hardwired into our psychology, and understanding why might be the key to finally breaking free from its grip. The human brain is an ancient machine running modern software. Deep in our neural circuitry lies what neuroscientists call the revenge circuit, a network of brain regions that activate when we perceive injustice. When someone wrongs you, your brain doesn't just register the hurt, it immediately begins calculating payback. The dorsal striatum lights up with anticipation. The prefrontal cortex starts planning. The anterior cingulate cortex processes the emotional pain and transforms it into motivation for action. But here's what's fascinating and disturbing about revenge. It operates on the same neural pathways as addiction. When you imagine getting back at someone, your brain releases dopamine, the same chemical that drives drug addiction, gambling compulsion, and every other behavioral dependency known to science. The more you fantasize about revenge, the more your brain craves it. You become literally addicted to the idea of payback. This is why revenge thoughts are so intrusive and persistent. Your brain treats the desire for vengeance like a survival need. Every time you think about the person who wronged you, your neural reward system activates, flooding your consciousness with vengeful scenarios. You don't choose these thoughts, they choose you, hijacking your attention and emotional energy until revenge becomes not just a desire, but an obsession. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this psychological trap better than anyone. In the 1880s, decades before we had brain scanners or neuroscience, he identified the precise mechanism by which human beings transform pain into poison. He called it ressentiment, a French word he used because the German language couldn't capture the specific psychological phenomenon he was describing. Ressentiment isn't simple resentment. It's something far more toxic and complex. Ressentiment is what happens when someone experiences a hurt so profound that they can't process it directly. Instead of confronting their pain, accepting their powerlessness, or working to change their situation, they mentally reverse their relationship to the injury. They transform their victimhood into a kind of moral superiority. They convince themselves that their suffering makes them virtuous and their oppressor evil. This psychological reversal is crucial because it allows the injured person to avoid the most painful truth of all that they were powerless to prevent what happened to them. Instead of facing their vulnerability, they create an elaborate mental framework where their weakness becomes strength, their defeat becomes moral victory, and their desire for revenge becomes righteous justice. Nietzsche observed this pattern everywhere in human culture. He saw it in ancient religions that promised the meek would inherit the earth. He saw it in political movements that glorified the oppressed while demonizing the successful. He saw it in individuals who spent their entire lives plotting against those who had wronged them decades earlier. What he realized was that ressentiment wasn't just a personal problem. It was a fundamental organizing principle of human psychology and culture. The person trapped in ressentiment doesn't want justice. They want their oppressor to suffer as they have suffered. But because they can rarely achieve direct revenge, they settle for something more insidious. They poison their own minds with fantasies of payback. They define their entire identity in opposition to the person who hurt them. They become professional victims, using their injury as a weapon against anyone who reminds them of their powerlessness. This is why revenge fantasies are so psychologically destructive. They keep you mentally tethered to the person who wronged you. Every moment you spend planning their downfall is a moment you're not building your own life. Every ounce of energy you devote to imagining their suffering is energy you're not investing in your own growth, relationships, or happiness. The person who hurt you may have moved on completely, but you remain frozen in the moment of injury, reliving it again and again through your vengeful imagination. Nietzsche called this the slave mentality, not because he believed in literal slavery, but because he recognized that ressentiment turns free people into mental slaves. The person consumed by revenge thoughts is no longer living their own life. They're living in reaction to someone else's actions. Their values, goals, and daily experiences all revolve around the person who injured them. They voluntarily surrendered their psychological freedom to the very person they claim to hate. Modern neuroscience has validated Nietzsche's insights in remarkable ways. Brain. Imaging studies show that people who ruminate on past injuries display hyperactivity in the medial prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for self-focused thinking. This creates what researchers call the rumination trap. The more you think about being wronged, the more your brain dedicates neural resources to thinking about being wronged. You literally rewire your mind to focus on grievance and revenge. The psychological cost of this neural rewiring is enormous. People who chronically ruminate on past injuries show elevated levels of stress hormones, compromised immune function, and increased risk of depression and anxiety. Their relationships suffer because they view every interaction through the lens of potential betrayal. Their careers stagnate because they spend more energy plotting against enemies than pursuing opportunities. Their creativity withers because vengeful thoughts crowd out original ideas and innovative solutions. Perhaps most tragically, the pursuit of revenge rarely provides the satisfaction people expect. Psychological research consistently shows that people who successfully retaliate against those who wronged them don't feel better afterward. Instead, they often feel empty, guilty, or disappointed that their victory wasn't as sweet as they had imagined. This is because revenge addresses the symptom of their pain, their powerlessness, but not the underlying wound, their damaged sense of self-worth. Nietzsche recognized that the person trapped in ressentiment faces a fundamental choice. They can remain psychologically enslaved to their injury, spending their life energy on fantasies of payback and schemes of retaliation, or they can choose what he called the path of the higher human, the individual who transforms their pain into power, their suffering into strength, and their injury into wisdom. This transformation isn't about forgiveness, at least not in the conventional sense. Nietzsche was deeply skeptical of traditional forgiveness because he saw it as another form of ressentiment, a way for the injured party to claim moral superiority over their oppressor. True transcendence of revenge doesn't come from pardoning the person who hurt you. It comes from becoming someone who can no longer be significantly hurt by what others do to you. This is what Nietzsche meant by his famous concept of the will to power. Most people misunderstand this idea, thinking it means the desire to dominate others. But Nietzsche's will to power is actually the drive to overcome yourself. to become master of your own reactions, emotions, and mental states. It's the decision to stop being a victim of circumstances and start being the creator of your own experience. The person who has developed genuine will to power doesn't seek revenge because they no longer identify as a victim. When someone wrongs them, they don't take it personally in the way that creates ressentiment. They might take practical steps to protect themselves or seek appropriate justice, but they don't burn with the desire for payback because their sense of self-worth doesn't depend on what others do to them. This psychological strength comes from what Nietzsche called self-creation, the ongoing project of defining yourself through your own values, goals, and actions rather than in reaction to how others treat you. The self-created individual has what psychologists now call an internal locus of control. They believe their happiness, success, and well-being come primarily from their own choices and efforts, not from external circumstances or other people's behavior. Developing this internal locus of control is one of the most effective ways to break free from the revenge trap. When you stop expecting the world to be fair, when you stop taking other people's actions as personal attacks on your worth, when you start measuring your life by your own standards rather than by comparison to others, the desire for revenge naturally diminishes. You become too busy creating your own life to waste time destroying someone else's. But this transformation requires facing some uncomfortable truths about human nature and social relationships. One of the hardest truths is that fairness is a human invention, not a natural law. The universe doesn't owe you justice. Bad people sometimes win. Good people sometimes suffer. Terrible things happen to innocent people, while terrible people prosper. This isn't a flaw in the system. It's simply how reality works. Most people find this truth unbearable, which is why they retreat into revenge fantasies and justice myths. They convince themselves that karma will eventually balance the scales, that what goes around comes around, that everyone gets what they deserve in the end. These beliefs provide psychological comfort, but they also keep people trapped in victim consciousness, waiting for external forces to right the wrongs they've experienced. Nietzsche argued that psychological freedom comes from accepting cosmic indifference without becoming cynical or nihilistic. Yes, the universe doesn't care about your pain. Yes, justice is often absent from human affairs. Yes, bad things happen to good people while bad people escape consequences. But none of this changes your capacity to create meaning, beauty, and value through your own choices and actions. This acceptance doesn't mean becoming passive or tolerating abuse. It means channeling your energy toward what you can control rather than wasting it on what you cannot. You can't control whether people wrong you, but you can control how you respond to being wronged. You can't control whether justice is served, but you can control whether you allow injustice to define your character. You can't control the past, but you can control whether you remain psychologically imprisoned by it. The alternative to revenge isn't forgiveness or acceptance, it's transcendence. It's becoming the kind of person who is too strong, too self-directed, too focused on their own growth and goals to be derailed by other people's harmful actions. This is what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate, the ability to embrace everything that happens to you, including injury and betrayal, as raw material for your own self-creation. This doesn't mean enjoying being hurt or seeking out suffering. It means recognizing that every experience, even painful ones, can contribute to your psychological and spiritual development if you approach them with the right mindset. The person who betrayed you taught you something about human nature. The injury you suffered revealed something about your own vulnerabilities that you can now strengthen. The injustice you experienced gave you insight into how the world actually works, rather than how you wished it worked. From this perspective, the person who wronged you isn't your enemy. They're your unwitting teacher. someone whose actions revealed truths you needed to learn and triggered growth you needed to experience. This doesn't make their behavior acceptable or excuse the harm they caused, but it does transform your relationship to the injury from victimhood to education, from ressentiment to wisdom. Modern psychology has validated many aspects of this Nietzschean approach through research on post-traumatic growth. Studies show that people who experience significant adversity often develop greater psychological resilience, deeper relationships, clearer priorities, and stronger sense of meaning than those who haven't been seriously challenged. But this growth only occurs when people actively work to extract meaning and strength from their difficult experiences rather than remaining stuck in victim identity. The process of transforming pain into power requires several key psychological shifts. First, you must stop taking other people's behavior as a reflection of your worth. When someone betrays you, lies to you, or treats you badly, their actions reveal their character, not yours. Your value as a human being doesn't decrease because someone else chose to behave poorly towards you. Second, you must develop what psychologists call cognitive flexibility, the ability to reinterpret experiences from multiple perspectives. The same event that initially seems like pure victimization can be reframed as a learning opportunity, a catalyst for growth, or a revelation about what you truly value. This reframing doesn't minimize the real harm that was done, but it prevents that harm from defining your entire relationship to the experience. Third, you must cultivate what Nietzsche called intellectual honesty, the courage to see yourself and others clearly, without comforting illusions. This means acknowledging your own role in situations where you were hurt, not to blame yourself, but to understand how you might make different choices in the future. It means seeing your enemies as complex human beings rather than pure evil, not to excuse their behavior, but to understand the psychological forces that drive harmful actions. Fourth, you must practice what Nietzsche called self-overcoming, the ongoing effort to become a better version of yourself regardless of what others do to you. This means setting your own standards for character, achievement, and behavior rather than defining yourself in opposition to those who have wronged you. It means measuring your progress by your own growth rather than by other people's failures or punishments. The person who masters these psychological skills develops what Nietzsche considered the highest form of human strength, the ability to create value and meaning even in the face of suffering, betrayal, and injustice. They become what he called a free spirit, someone whose happiness and sense of purpose come from within rather than from external validation, fairness, or revenge. This transformation has practical benefits that extend far beyond philosophical satisfaction. Research shows that people who score high on measures of self-mastery and internal locus of control have better relationships, greater career success, superior physical health, and higher life satisfaction than those who remain trapped in victim consciousness and revenge fantasies. They also develop what psychologists call anti-fragility, the ability to become stronger rather than weaker when faced with stress, adversity, and challenge. Unlike resilient people who bounce back from difficulties, anti-fragile individuals actually benefit from problems, using each setback as an opportunity for growth and each injury as a catalyst for development. But perhaps the most profound benefit of transcending the revenge trap is the recovery of your own life energy. Revenge thoughts are psychological parasites that drain your mental resources without providing any real benefit. When you stop feeding these thoughts with your attention, you suddenly have enormous amounts of energy available for creative projects, meaningful relationships, and personal goals. Many people resist giving up their revenge fantasies because they feel like doing so would mean letting their oppressor win. But this thinking reveals the fundamental trap of ressentiment. You cannot simultaneously focus on someone else's defeat and your own victory. The energy you spend plotting their downfall is energy you're not investing in your own rise. The time you spend hoping they suffer is time you're not spending creating the life you actually want. Nietzsche recognized that the strongest people aren't those who successfully destroy their enemies. The strongest people are those who are too busy building something beautiful to waste time on destruction. They've internalized the profound truth that the best revenge against someone who wronged you isn't harming them. It's becoming so successful, happy, and fulfilled that their opinion of you becomes completely irrelevant. This doesn't mean ignoring genuine injustice or failing to protect yourself from ongoing harm. There's a crucial difference between seeking revenge and seeking justice. Justice is about preventing future harm and maintaining social order. Revenge is about inflicting suffering to satisfy your own emotional needs. Justice looks forward and seeks to create better outcomes. Revenge looks backward and seeks to balance emotional scales. The person who has transcended ressentiment can still pursue justice when appropriate, but they do so from a place of strength rather than weakness, from principle rather than emotion, from a desire to protect rather than a need to punish. They don't need their oppressor to suffer in order to feel good about themselves. Their self-worth comes from their own character and achievements, not from other people's failures or punishments. This psychological position gives them enormous practical advantages in conflicts and disputes. Because they're not driven by the need for emotional satisfaction, they can make strategic decisions based on what actually serves their interests, rather than what feels satisfying in the moment. They can negotiate from strength because they don't desperately need specific outcomes to validate their worth. They can walk away from situations that others remain trapped in because their happiness doesn't depend on winning every battle. Perhaps most importantly, they become capable of what Nietzsche called great health, a state of psychological and spiritual vitality that comes from living according to your own values rather than in reaction to external circumstances. Great health isn't the absence of problems or pain. It's the presence of meaning, purpose, and presence of and self-direction, even in the face of difficulties. The person with great health responds to betrayal by strengthening their discernment about who to trust. They respond to injustice by clarifying their own values and committing more deeply to living by them. They respond to attack by examining what made them vulnerable and developing better psychological armor. In every case, they use negative experiences as opportunities for positive development. This approach to life requires what Nietzsche called intellectual courage, the willingness to question comfortable beliefs and face uncomfortable truths. It's easier to blame others for your unhappiness than to take responsibility for your own emotional state. It's more satisfying to fantasize about revenge than to do the hard work of self-improvement. It's more comforting to believe in ultimate justice than to accept cosmic indifference and create your own meaning. But intellectual courage ultimately leads to psychological freedom. When you stop waiting for external validation, fairness, or revenge to make you feel better, you realize that you've had the power to feel better all along. When you stop defining yourself by what others have done to you, you discover who you actually are beneath your injuries and grievances. When you stop trying to control other people's behavior, you realize how much control you actually have over your own life. This freedom isn't easy to achieve, and it's not a permanent state that you reach once and maintain forever. It's an ongoing practice, a daily choice to focus on what you can control rather than what you cannot, to invest energy in creation rather than destruction, to measure yourself by your own standards rather than by comparison to others. The practice becomes easier with time as you develop what psychologists call emotional regulation skills. These include the ability to notice revenge thoughts without being overwhelmed by them, to feel anger without acting on it destructively, to acknowledge pain without letting it define your identity, and to maintain your values even when others violate theirs. Meditation, therapy, journaling, and other reflective practices can help develop these skills. But the most powerful tool is simply the decision to prioritize your own growth and happiness over getting back at those who have hurt you. This decision must be renewed daily because the revenge circuit in your brain will continue to generate vengeful thoughts as long as you have memories of being wronged. The goal isn't to eliminate these thoughts entirely. That's probably impossible for most people. The goal is to change your relationship to the thoughts, to see them as psychological noise, rather than calls to action, to observe them without being controlled by them. When a revenge fantasy arises, you can acknowledge it and then redirect your attention to something that actually serves your long-term interests. Over time, this practice weakens the revenge circuit through what neuroscientists call synaptic pruning. Neural pathways that aren't used regularly become less active and less intrusive. Meanwhile, the neural pathways associated with self-directed goals, creative projects, and positive relationships become stronger and more dominant. You literally rewire your brain to focus on building rather than destroying. The ultimate test of whether you've successfully transcended the revenge trap is whether you can genuinely wish your former enemies well. This doesn't mean trusting them, spending time with them, or pretending their harmful behavior was acceptable. It means reaching a state where their suffering no longer brings you satisfaction and their success no longer brings you pain. When you reach this state, you've achieved what Nietzsche considered the highest form of human development. You've become truly free, not because you've gotten revenge on those who wronged you, but because you no longer need revenge to feel good about yourself. You've reclaimed your power not by destroying your enemies, but by becoming someone who cannot be significantly diminished by what others do to you. This transformation benefits not just you, but everyone around you. People who have transcended ressentiment are more generous, creative, and inspiring, because they're not constantly defending themselves against imaginary attacks or plotting against perceived enemies. They have more energy available for positive relationships and meaningful projects because they're not wasting it on psychological warfare. They also break the cycle of revenge that perpetuates so much human suffering. When someone wrongs you and you respond with revenge, you often create a new injury that demands its own retaliation. This can continue for generations, with families, communities, and entire cultures trapped in cycles of mutual harm. The person who responds to injury with growth rather than revenge breaks this cycle, creating space for healing and progress. This cyclical nature of revenge is one of its most destructive features. Neuroscientists have discovered that the brain's mirror neuron system makes us naturally inclined to reciprocate the emotions and behaviors we encounter. When someone treats us with hostility, our brains automatically prepare hostile responses. When someone betrays us, we instinctively begin planning betrayal in return. This mirroring happens below the level of conscious awareness, which is why revenge often feels like a natural, justified response, rather than a choice we're making. But understanding this neurological tendency gives us power over it. When you recognize that your desire for revenge is largely an automatic brain response rather than a reasoned decision, you can begin to interrupt the pattern. You can pause between the trigger and the response, creating space for more conscious choices about how to proceed. This pause is where true psychological freedom lives. In that moment between stimulus and response, you have the opportunity to choose transcendence over retaliation, growth over grievance, creation over destruction. Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor who understood suffering intimately, called this space between stimulus and response, the source of human freedom and dignity. Nietzsche would have agreed, seeing it as the birthplace of self-overcoming and genuine power. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for revenge, while simultaneously making its psychological costs more visible. Social media platforms have weaponized ressentiment, creating algorithms that amplify outrage and division because these emotions generate engagement. Cancel culture represents a modern form of collective revenge, where online mobs attempt to destroy individuals who have violated evolving social norms. What makes digital revenge particularly toxic is its permanence and scale. A moment of anger can result in a post or comment that follows someone for years. A desire for payback can mobilize thousands of strangers to participate in someone's destruction. The immediate satisfaction of public shaming can destroy lives and careers in ways that far exceed the original injury. Yet the psychology remains the same. The person who participates in online revenge mobs is still trapped in ressentiment, still defining themselves by their opposition to others, still burning their life energy in the service of destruction rather than creation. The medium has changed, but the underlying psychological pattern that Nietzsche identified remains constant. The solution is also the same. Develop the psychological strength to define yourself by your own values and goals rather than by your opposition to others. Build the emotional resilience to withstand injury without needing to inflict injury in return. Cultivate the wisdom to distinguish between justice and revenge, between protecting yourself and destroying others. This requires understanding the difference between healthy anger and toxic resentment. Healthy anger is a temporary emotional response to genuine injustice. It motivates protective action, boundary setting, and appropriate consequences. It burns hot but brief, accomplishing its purpose and then dissipating. Toxic resentment, by contrast, is a chronic emotional state that feeds on itself, growing stronger over time rather than resolving. The person experiencing healthy anger asks practical questions like, how do I protect myself? What boundaries do I need to set? What actions serve my long-term interests? The person trapped in toxic resentment asks destructive questions like, how can I make them pay? What will hurt them most? How can I prove I was right and they were wrong? These different questions lead to radically different outcomes. Healthy anger often results in positive changes that prevent future harm and improve your life circumstances. Toxic resentment typically results in actions that may harm your target, but also damage your own reputation, relationships, and psychological well-being. Nietzsche understood that the desire for revenge often masks deeper fears about our own powerlessness and vulnerability. When someone hurts us, we don't just feel angry about their specific actions. We feel terrified about our inability to prevent similar injuries in the future. Revenge fantasies provide a temporary escape from this terror, creating the illusion that we can control how others treat us by making them afraid of our retaliation. But this illusion comes at an enormous cost. The energy you spend trying to control others through fear is energy you're not investing in actually increasing your own power, competence, and resilience. The time you spend plotting revenge is time you're not spending on building the skills, relationships, and resources that would genuinely protect you from future harm. True power isn't the ability to harm those who have harmed you. True power is the ability to build a life so strong, fulfilling, and well-defended that what others do to you becomes increasingly irrelevant. This is what Nietzsche meant when he wrote that the best revenge is not to be like your enemy. The ultimate victory over someone who has wronged you isn't their destruction, it's your transcendence. This transcendence requires developing what psychologists call emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish Between subtle differences in emotional states, most people use revenge as a one-size-fits-all response to a wide variety of negative emotions. They feel hurt, disappointed, frustrated, embarrassed, or afraid, but they interpret all of these feelings as anger that demands retaliation. Emotional granularity allows you to respond more appropriately to different types of emotional pain. If you feel hurt because someone you trusted betrayed you, the appropriate response might be to grieve the loss of the relationship and learn to be more discerning about who you trust. If you feel embarrassed because someone humiliated you publicly, the appropriate response might be to develop thicker skin and better strategies for managing your reputation. In each case, the specific emotion provides information about what you need to do to protect and strengthen yourself. But if you only recognize anger and respond with revenge, you miss these more nuanced and ultimately more useful emotional messages. Developing emotional granularity requires mindfulness, the ability to observe your internal states with curiosity rather than immediately reacting to them. When you feel the urge for revenge, pause and ask yourself what other emotions might be present. Are you feeling vulnerable and need to increase your sense of security? Are you feeling rejected and need to strengthen your sense of self-worth? Are you feeling powerless and need to identify areas where you actually have control? These underlying emotions point toward constructive actions that can actually improve your life circumstances. Revenge addresses none of these deeper needs. It might provide temporary emotional relief, but it doesn't increase your security, self-worth, or genuine power. In fact, it often undermines all three by damaging your reputation, relationships, and self-respect. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence provides another powerful tool for transcending the revenge trap. He asked us to imagine that we would have to live our entire lives over again, exactly as they happened, an infinite number of times. Given this scenario, what choices would you make? What kind of person would you choose to be? Most people, when faced with this thought experiment, realize that they wouldn't want to spend eternity consumed by resentment and revenge fantasies. They wouldn't want to relive the psychological torture of ruminating on past injuries and plotting future retaliation. They would want to spend their time creating beauty, building relationships, pursuing knowledge, and developing their capabilities. This realization reveals something profound about the nature of revenge. It's not actually what we want when we strip away our emotional reactivity and think clearly about how we want to spend our limited time on Earth. Revenge is a temporary emotional impulse that, if followed, leads us away from the kind of life we actually want to live. The person who has truly internalized this understanding begins to see revenge fantasies as interruptions to their real life, rather than important messages about what they should do. When vengeful thoughts arise, they don't engage with the content. They simply notice the thoughts and redirect their attention to activities that align with their deeper values and long-term goals. This redirection becomes easier with practice as you develop what neuroscientists call cognitive control, the ability to direct your attention consciously rather than being controlled by whatever thoughts and emotions arise automatically. Strong cognitive control is associated with better mental health, more successful relationships, greater career achievement, and higher life satisfaction. You can strengthen your cognitive control through meditation, therapy, cognitive behavioral techniques, and simply by practicing the skill of redirecting your attention when you notice it has been captured by unproductive thoughts. Like physical exercise, mental exercise builds strength over time. The more you practice choosing your focus, the more natural and effortless this choice becomes. The cultural implications of transcending revenge extend far beyond individual psychology. Societies that valorize revenge create cultures of violence, suspicion, and perpetual conflict. Societies that value forgiveness and personal growth create cultures of innovation, cooperation, and collective flourishing. Your individual choice about how to respond to injury contributes to which kind of culture we all live in. This is why Nietzsche believed that psychological evolution at the individual level was necessary for social evolution at the collective level. You cannot create a healthy society from psychologically unhealthy individuals. You cannot build institutions based on justice and cooperation if the people running those institutions are consumed by resentment and desire for payback. Every person who chooses transcendence over revenge contributes to the possibility of a more evolved form of human culture. They demonstrate that it's possible to maintain strength and dignity without needing to destroy others. They show that true power comes from internal development rather than external domination. This demonstration is particularly important in our current historical moment when many traditional sources of meaning and identity are being questioned or dismantled. In such times, people often retreat into tribal thinking and zero-sum competition. They define themselves by who they oppose, rather than by what they stand for. They seek meaning through conflict, rather than through creation. The alternative is to use periods of cultural upheaval as opportunities for individual growth and self-definition. When external structures are unstable, you have more freedom to choose your own values and create your own path. When old authorities are being questioned, you have more space to become your own authority. When traditional roles are breaking down, you have more opportunity to define yourself authentically. This process of self-creation requires what Nietzsche called intellectual courage, the willingness to think independently, even when your ideas are unpopular or threatening to others. It requires emotional courage, the ability to feel difficult emotions without immediately seeking escape through distraction, substances, or revenge. It requires moral courage, the strength to act according to your values, even when others pressure you to conform or retaliate. These forms of courage are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. As you develop the intellectual courage to think clearly about your experiences, you gain the emotional courage to face painful truths. As you develop the emotional courage to sit with discomfort, you gain the moral courage to act according to your principles rather than your impulses. The person who has developed all three forms of courage becomes what Nietzsche called a free spirit, someone whose thoughts, feelings, and actions are self-determined rather than reactive. They don't need revenge because they don't define themselves as victims. They don't seek external validation because they have developed internal standards. They don't fear others' power because they have cultivated their own. This psychological independence is perhaps the most practical benefit of transcending the revenge trap. When you're not psychologically dependent on others' behavior for your own well-being, you become much more effective in all your relationships and endeavors. You can negotiate from strength because you don't desperately need specific outcomes. You can take risks because failure doesn't threaten your core sense of self. You can love others without trying to control them because your happiness doesn't depend on their choices. These capabilities compound over time, creating what psychologists call an upward spiral of positive development. Success builds confidence, which enables greater risks, which create more opportunities for success. Strong relationships provide support for challenging projects, which build competence, which attracts even stronger relationships. Internal security enables external adventure, which develops resilience, which increases internal security. The person trapped in revenge cycles experiences the opposite pattern, a downward spiral, where resentment creates isolation, which limits opportunities, which increases resentment. They become stuck in psychological patterns that prevent growth rather than facilitating it. They use their energy to maintain grudges rather than build capabilities. They define success as others' failure rather than their own achievement. Breaking free from this downward spiral requires what therapists call pattern interruption, the deliberate disruption of automatic psychological and behavioral sequences. When you notice yourself falling into revenge fantasies, you can interrupt the pattern by asking different questions, engaging in different activities, or simply changing your physical position or environment. Pattern interruption works because it prevents the neural pathways associated with resentment from strengthening through repetition. Every time you interrupt a revenge fantasy and redirect your attention elsewhere, you weaken the psychological habit of rumination and strengthen the habit of conscious choice. Over time, these small interruptions add up to major changes in your default psychological patterns. Instead of automatically sliding into resentment when you're hurt, you automatically begin looking for growth opportunities. Instead of immediately plotting revenge when you're wronged, you immediately start planning how to protect yourself better in the future. This shift from reactive to proactive thinking is one of the most important psychological skills you can develop. Reactive thinking keeps you trapped in the past, constantly responding to things that have already happened. Proactive thinking orients you toward the future, focusing on what you can do to create better outcomes going forward. The person with strong proactive thinking skills responds to betrayal by improving their ability to assess trustworthiness. They respond to failure by developing better strategies and skills. They respond to criticism by examining what might be valid and useful in the feedback. In every case, they extract value from negative experiences rather than just brooding on the pain. This approach to life requires what Viktor Frankl called the will to meaning, the drive to find significance and purpose in every experience, even difficult ones. Unlike Freud's will to pleasure or Adler's will to power, Frankl's will to meaning doesn't seek to avoid or overcome suffering. Instead, it seeks to transform suffering into wisdom, pain into strength, and setbacks into comebacks. Nietzsche would have appreciated this concept because it aligns with his belief that the highest human achievements come through struggle rather than comfort. The person who has never been seriously challenged, betrayed, or defeated may appear fortunate, but they often lack the depth, resilience, and wisdom that come from successfully navigating adversity. This doesn't mean seeking out suffering or remaining in harmful situations. It means recognizing that some degree of difficulty, conflict, and pain is inevitable in any meaningful life, and that your response to these challenges largely determines the quality of your character and the trajectory of your development. The person who has mastered the psychology of revenge understands that their enemies are often their greatest teachers, even if the lessons are taught unwillingly and received painfully. Every betrayal reveals something important about human nature or your own vulnerabilities. Every attack shows you where your defenses need strengthening. Every injustice clarifies your values and priorities. From this perspective, the person who wronged you isn't just someone to be hated or pitied. They're someone who provided you with valuable, if painful, information about how the world actually works. This information, properly processed, can make you stronger, wiser, and more effective in all your future interactions. This reframing doesn't excuse harmful behavior or eliminate the need for appropriate boundaries and consequences, but it does transform your relationship to negative experiences from pure victimhood to a more complex mixture of pain and growth. You can simultaneously acknowledge that what happened to you was wrong and appreciate how the experience contributed to your development. This nuanced understanding of adversity is one of the hallmarks of psychological maturity. Mature individuals don't see the world in simple terms of good and evil, victim and perpetrator, friend and enemy. They recognize that most situations involve complex mixtures of motivation, that most people have both positive and negative qualities, and that most experiences contain both costs and benefits. This complexity can be uncomfortable because it prevents the simple moral clarity that makes revenge feel justified. It's easier to hate someone completely than to hold the paradox that they may have harmed you and helped you simultaneously. It's simpler to see yourself as pure victim than to acknowledge that you may have contributed to your own injury while still being wronged by others. But this psychological complexity is also liberating because it prevents you from being trapped in overly simplistic narratives about your life and relationships. When you can hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, you become less reactive and more responsive. When you can see nuance in difficult situations, you become more skillful at navigating them. The cultivation of this psychological sophistication requires what Nietzsche called perspectivism, the ability to view situations from multiple angles rather than being locked into a single viewpoint. The person trapped in revenge can only see their injury from one perspective. They were wronged and deserve retaliation. The person who has developed perspectivism can see the same situation from many angles. The complex motivations of all parties involved, the systemic factors that contributed to the conflict, the growth opportunities hidden within the pain. This multi-perspective awareness doesn't eliminate strong emotions or clear moral judgments. You can still feel angry about injustice and committed to your values while also recognizing the complexity of human situations. But perspectivism does prevent you from being overwhelmed by single emotions or trapped in rigid interpretations of your experiences. The practical benefits of this psychological flexibility are enormous. In conflicts, you can understand your opponents well enough to negotiate effectively. In relationships, you can see your partner's behavior in context, rather than taking everything personally. In your career, you can learn from criticism and setbacks rather than being derailed by them. Perhaps most importantly, perspectivism allows you to maintain hope even in difficult circumstances. When you can only see situations from one angle, negative experiences can seem permanent and all-encompassing. When you can shift perspectives, you realize that current difficulties are temporary states rather than permanent conditions, and that every situation contains multiple possibilities for how it might develop. This hopeful orientation is crucial for psychological health because it maintains your sense of agency even when you're facing serious challenges. The person who believes that negative situations are permanent and unchangeable naturally becomes passive and despairing. The person who recognizes that all situations are fluid and contain multiple potentials remains active and optimistic. Maintaining this active, optimistic stance in the face of injury and injustice is perhaps the ultimate test of psychological strength. It's easy to be hopeful when things are going well. It's much more challenging to maintain hope when you've been betrayed, defeated, or humiliated. But this is exactly when hope is most important and most transformative. The person who can maintain hope and agency, even after serious setbacks, demonstrates what Nietzsche considered the highest form of human courage. They showed that the human spirit can remain unbroken even when the human body or circumstances are damaged. They proved that external events, no matter how painful, cannot ultimately determine the quality of consciousness or character. This indomitable quality of consciousness is what Nietzsche meant by the will to power in its most elevated form. It's not the crude desire to dominate others, but the refined capacity to remain master of your own inner life regardless of what happens to you externally. It's the ability to create meaning, beauty, and value, even in the midst of chaos, suffering, and injustice. Developing this level of psychological mastery requires years of practice and often significant suffering that serves as a crucible for character development. But the rewards are proportional to the effort invested. The person who has developed true inner strength becomes virtually unshakable in their core sense of self and purpose. They can face criticism without being devastated, betrayal without being consumed by revenge, failure without being paralyzed by despair. They maintain their center in all circumstances because their center is internal rather than dependent on external validation or favorable circumstances. This internal locus of strength is what allows them to respond to injury with growth rather than resentment. When someone wrongs them, their immediate question isn't "how can I get back at them?" but "how can I learn from this?" When they face setbacks, they don't ask "who's to blame?" but "what can I do differently next time?" These different questions lead to radically different outcomes. The revenge-focused questions trap you in the past and make you dependent on others' behavior for your own emotional state. The growth-focused questions orient you toward the future and maintain your sense of agency over your own development. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration into the psychology of revenge, it's worth reflecting on how this understanding applies to the broader human condition. Every person alive has been hurt by others. Every person has felt the desire for payback. Every person has struggled with the choice between growth and grievance. Your individual response to this universal challenge matters more than you might think. When you choose transcendence over revenge, you don't just improve your own life. You contribute to the evolution of human consciousness itself. You demonstrate that it's possible to break cycles of retaliation that have persisted for generations. You show that individuals can rise above their conditioning and choose more elevated responses to life's inevitable challenges. This contribution to human evolution isn't abstract or theoretical. It's practical and immediate. Every family, workplace, community, and culture is made healthier by the presence of individuals who respond to injury with wisdom rather than retaliation. These people serve as stabilizers who prevent conflicts from escalating and as models who show others what psychological maturity looks like. They also serve as healers who help repair the damage caused by cycles of revenge and resentment. Through their refusal to perpetuate harm, they create space for genuine reconciliation and collective growth. They prove that it's possible to maintain strength and dignity without needing to destroy others. The world desperately needs more such individuals. In every sphere of human activity, from politics to business to personal relationships, we see the destructive effects of revenge-based thinking. People define themselves by their enemies rather than their aspirations. They measure success by others' failures rather than their own achievements. They waste enormous amounts of energy on conflicts that could be redirected toward creative and beneficial activities. The alternative begins with individuals who understand the psychology of revenge and choose a different path. It spreads through their example, their teachings, and their influence on others. Over time, it has the potential to transform entire cultures from revenge-based to growth-based orientations. This transformation is both an individual and collective responsibility. You cannot wait for others to change before you begin your own journey toward psychological freedom. But you also cannot complete this journey in isolation from others. The path beyond revenge requires both personal commitment and community support. Finding or creating communities of people who share your commitment to growth over grievance is crucial for maintaining this orientation over the long term. These communities provide encouragement during difficult periods, accountability when you're tempted to revert to old patterns, and models of what's possible when people commit to transcending their basic psychological drives. The psychology of revenge ultimately reveals the fundamental choice that faces every human being: how to respond to the inevitable pain and injustice of existence. You can allow these experiences to make you bitter, reactive, and consumed with destroying others. Or you can use them as fuel for your own development, transformation, and contribution to human flourishing. This choice isn't made once and then maintained forever. It's made daily, sometimes moment by moment, as you encounter new challenges and old triggers. Each time you choose growth over revenge, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with psychological freedom. Each time you choose transcendence over retaliation, you contribute to your own evolution and the evolution of human consciousness itself. But what does this choice look like in practical terms? How do you actually transform the desire for revenge into fuel for personal growth? The process requires understanding the specific psychological mechanisms that keep people trapped in resentment and developing concrete strategies for interrupting these patterns. The first mechanism to understand is what psychologists call the rumination trap. When someone wrongs you, your brain naturally begins replaying the incident, analyzing what happened, and imagining different outcomes. This replay serves an important function initially, helping you process the experience and extract useful information about what went wrong and how to prevent similar problems in the future. But rumination becomes pathological when it continues indefinitely, without leading to resolution or learning. The person trapped in chronic rumination replays the same injury over and over, each time becoming more angry and more convinced that revenge is necessary. They're not actually processing the experience anymore. They're reinforcing their victimhood and strengthening their desire for retaliation. Breaking free from the rumination trap requires recognizing when your thinking has shifted from productive processing to destructive repetition. Productive processing asks questions like, what can I learn from this? How can I protect myself better in the future? What does this reveal about my values and priorities? Destructive rumination asks questions like, how could they do this to me? What's wrong with them? How can I make them pay? When you notice that your thinking has shifted into destructive rumination, you can interrupt the pattern through what cognitive therapists call thought stopping. This involves consciously redirecting your attention to something more productive whenever you catch yourself rehashing past injuries without learning anything new. Thought stopping requires practice because rumination is often an unconscious habit. Many people spend hours each day ruminating on past hurts without realizing they're doing it. They might be physically present in conversations or activities, but mentally they're replaying old conflicts and planning future revenge. This divided attention reduces the quality of their present experience and prevents them from fully engaging with current opportunities. Developing mindfulness skills can help you recognize when you've slipped into rumination mode. Mindfulness involves paying attention to your current thoughts, feelings, and sensations without judgment. When you're mindful, you notice that your mind has wandered into revenge fantasies rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. This awareness creates space for choice. Once you recognize that you're ruminating, you can decide whether to continue feeding these thoughts or to redirect your attention elsewhere. Most people find that rumination stops being compelling once they become fully conscious of it. The thoughts lose their grip when they're no longer operating below the level of awareness. Another crucial mechanism in the psychology of revenge is what Nietzsche called the moralization of suffering. This involves transforming personal pain into moral outrage, reframing your injury as evidence of your virtue and your oppressor's evil. While this transformation can provide temporary psychological relief, it ultimately traps you in victim identity and prevents genuine healing. The person who has moralized their suffering can't let go of their grievance because doing so would require abandoning their sense of moral superiority. They become addicted to their victim status because it seems to provide meaning, identity, and social support. But this addiction comes at an enormous cost to their psychological development and life satisfaction. True healing requires what philosophers call moral courage, the willingness to examine your own role in difficult situations without excusing others' harmful behavior. This doesn't mean blaming yourself for being victimized. It means honestly assessing whether you missed warning signs, ignored your intuition, or made choices that increased your vulnerability. This honest self-assessment can be painful because it challenges the simple narrative where you are purely innocent and others are purely evil. But it's also liberating because it restores your sense of agency. When you recognize that you have some influence over what happens to you, even in situations where others behave badly, you regain the power to make different choices in the future. The process of moral courage also involves distinguishing between impact and intent when evaluating others' behavior. Someone can cause you significant harm without intending to do so. They might have been acting from their own pain, ignorance, or psychological limitations, rather than from malice towards you specifically. This distinction doesn't minimize the real damage that was done to you. Impact matters regardless of intent, but understanding the difference between malicious attacks and misguided actions can help you respond more appropriately and avoid the kind of all-consuming hatred that characterizes ressentiment. When someone hurts you intentionally, you need strong boundaries and possibly complete separation from that person. When someone hurts you unintentionally, you might benefit more from clear communication about the impact of their behavior and perhaps education about how to do better in the future. Either way, your primary focus should be on protecting yourself and learning from the experience rather than on punishing the other person. Punishment might be appropriate in some cases, but it should serve the goals of justice, protection, and education, rather than satisfying your desire for revenge. This brings us to one of Nietzsche's most important insights about human psychology: the distinction between reactive and creative responses to adversity. Reactive responses are determined by what others do to you. Creative responses are determined by your own values, goals, and vision for your life. The person trapped in reactive mode spends their time and energy responding to others' actions. They define themselves by their opposition to enemies, their resistance to unfairness, and their demands for apologies and restitution. Their entire life orientation becomes shaped by what others have done to them. The person operating in creative mode uses their experiences, including negative ones, as raw material for their own self-creation. They ask themselves how each experience can contribute to their growth, wisdom, and effectiveness. They maintain focus on their own goals and values regardless of how others treat them. This shift from reactive to creative mode is perhaps the most practical application of Nietzschean philosophy to everyday life. It doesn't require believing in any particular metaphysical claims or adopting any specific worldview. It simply requires taking responsibility for your own responses to life's inevitable challenges and opportunities. Creative mode thinking looks at betrayal and asks, how can this experience teach me to better evaluate trustworthiness in others? Reactive mode thinking looks at betrayal and asks, how can I make the betrayer pay for what they did? Creative mode thinking looks at failure and asks, what skills do I need to develop to increase my chances of success next time? Reactive mode thinking looks at failure and asks, whose fault was this, and how can I get back at them? Creative mode thinking looks at criticism and asks, what valid points can I extract from this feedback to improve my performance? Reactive mode thinking looks at criticism and asks, how dare they attack me? And how can I prove them wrong? The questions you habitually ask yourself in response to adversity largely determine the trajectory of your psychological development. Ask creative questions consistently, and you develop resilience, wisdom, and effectiveness. Ask reactive questions consistently, and you develop resentment, stagnation, and chronic dissatisfaction. Changing your default questions requires conscious effort because most people's reactive patterns were formed early in life and operate automatically. You might need to write down creative questions and refer to them when you're upset. You might need to practice asking these questions out loud until they become natural. You might need to work with a therapist, coach, or mentor who can help you recognize when you've slipped back into reactive mode. The payoff for this effort is enormous. People who operate primarily in creative mode report higher life satisfaction, better relationships, greater career success, and superior physical health compared to those who remain trapped in reactive patterns. They also contribute more to their communities and families because they're focused on building rather than destroying. This creative orientation becomes particularly important when dealing with what psychologists call complex trauma, injuries that involve betrayal by people you trusted and depended on. Complex trauma is especially likely to generate desires for revenge because it shatters your basic assumptions about safety, trust, and human nature. When someone you love betrays you deeply, you don't just lose the relationship, you lose your faith in your own judgment, your confidence in other people's reliability, and your sense of security in the world. These losses can be even more devastating than the original betrayal, and they create powerful motivation for revenge as a way of restoring your sense of justice and control. But revenge can never actually restore what was lost through betrayal. It cannot give you back your innocence, your trust, or your sense of safety. What it can do is trap you in cycles of anger and retaliation that prevent you from rebuilding these psychological resources through healthier means. Recovering from complex trauma requires grieving what was lost rather than trying to get it back through revenge. You need to mourn the relationship that ended, the person you thought you knew, and the worldview that made you feel safe. This grieving process is painful, but it's also necessary for moving forward. Grief, unlike revenge, actually helps you process and integrate difficult experiences. When you allow yourself to feel the full weight of what you've lost, you create space for new growth and new connections. When you remain focused on getting back at those who hurt you, you prevent this natural healing process from occurring. The grieving process also helps you develop what trauma therapists call earned security, the ability to form healthy relationships despite having been betrayed in the past. Earned security comes from processing your traumatic experiences thoroughly enough that they no longer control your present relationships. People with earned security can trust again, love again, and take risks again because they've learned to distinguish between past experiences and present realities. They don't project their old injuries onto new relationships, and they don't let their past betrayals prevent them from being open to future connections. This psychological flexibility is impossible to achieve while you're consumed with revenge fantasies. Revenge keeps you psychologically tethered to your past injuries, preventing the kind of emotional processing that allows for genuine healing and growth. The development of earned security also requires what attachment theorists call mentalization, the ability to understand your own and others' behavior in terms of underlying mental states, emotions, and motivations. When you can mentalize effectively, you're less likely to take others' behavior personally and more likely to respond appropriately to their actual intentions and capabilities. For example, if someone breaks a commitment to you, mentalizing allows you to consider various possible explanations for their behavior. Maybe they're overwhelmed and poor at managing their responsibilities. Maybe they're dealing with personal crises you don't know about. Maybe they have different values around commitments than you do. Maybe they're genuinely unreliable and not someone you should depend on in the future. Each of these possibilities suggests different responses. If they're overwhelmed, you might offer support or adjust your expectations. If they're dealing with crises, you might show compassion and flexibility. If they have different values, you might have a conversation about expectations. If they're unreliable, you might limit your involvement with them. But if you don't mentalize and instead immediately assume that their behavior was a personal attack or deliberate disrespect, you're likely to respond with anger, accusations, or desires for revenge. These responses often escalate conflicts and damage relationships that might have been repaired through more thoughtful communication. Mentalization is a skill that can be developed through practice, therapy, and mindful attention to the complexity of human motivation. As you become better at understanding why people behave as they do, you become less reactive to their behavior and more skilled at protecting yourself from genuine harm while avoiding unnecessary conflicts with people who aren't actually trying to hurt you. This skill becomes particularly important in our current cultural moment, where social media and political polarization have created environments that discourage mentalization and encourage simplistic interpretations of others' behavior. Online spaces often reward outrage and punishment while discouraging nuance and understanding. The result is a culture where people routinely attribute the worst possible motives to those who disagree with them, where minor transgressions are treated as major moral failures, and where public shaming and social ostracism are used as tools of social control. These dynamics create perfect conditions for collective ressentiment, where entire groups define themselves by their opposition to other groups. Breaking free from these toxic cultural patterns requires individuals who are willing to practice mentalization even when it's not rewarded or recognized. It requires people who will consider complex explanations for others' behavior even when simple explanations are more emotionally satisfying. It requires individuals who will focus on understanding and problem solving rather than blame and punishment. This cultural contribution is another way that your personal journey beyond revenge serves larger purposes. Every time you respond to conflict with curiosity rather than condemnation, you model a different way of being human. Every time you choose understanding over outrage, you demonstrate that it's possible to maintain strength and principles without needing to destroy those who disagree with you. The ripple effects of these choices extend far beyond your immediate relationships. People who witness others responding to adversity with wisdom rather than revenge often find inspiration to examine their own reactive patterns. Parents who model creative rather than reactive responses teach their children more evolved ways of handling conflict. Leaders who respond to challenges with growth mindset rather than blame create organizational cultures that prioritize problem solving over politics. These individual contributions to cultural evolution matter more than most people realize. Social change often begins with individuals who embody different possibilities for how humans can respond to life's challenges. These individuals become examples that others can follow, demonstrating that alternatives to revenge and resentment are not only possible, but preferable. The person who has successfully transcended the revenge trap often becomes what psychologists call a wounded healer. Someone who uses their own experiences of pain and recovery to help others navigate similar challenges. They have credibility that comes from having walked the path themselves. And they have wisdom that comes from having successfully transformed suffering into strength. This wounded healer role represents one of the highest forms of meaning that can be extracted from difficult experiences. Instead of allowing your injuries to make you bitter and destructive, you allow them to make you compassionate and helpful. Instead of using your pain as justification for hurting others, you use it as motivation for preventing others from experiencing unnecessary suffering. The transformation from victim to wounded healer is perhaps the ultimate victory over those who have harmed you. They intended to diminish you, but instead they inadvertently contributed to your wisdom and compassion. They meant to break you, but instead they provided raw material for your strength and resilience. This doesn't mean feeling grateful for harmful experiences or pretending that bad things are really good things in disguise. It means recognizing that your response to harmful experiences is what ultimately determines their meaning and impact on your life. The person who harmed you had power over the initial injury, but they don't have power over what you do with that injury. They can't control whether you let it destroy you or whether you transform it into wisdom. They can't determine whether you remain trapped in victim identity or whether you evolve into someone who helps others avoid similar suffering. This recognition of your ultimate power over the meaning of your experiences is perhaps the most liberating insight in all of psychology. External events can certainly influence your life, sometimes dramatically, but they cannot determine your character, your values, or your contribution to the world. These things remain within your control regardless of what others do to you. As we reach the end of our exploration into the psychology of revenge, it's worth reflecting on what this understanding means for how you live your daily life. The principles we've discussed aren't just philosophical abstractions, they're practical tools for navigating the inevitable conflicts, betrayals, and disappointments that everyone faces. When someone cuts you off in traffic, you can practice choosing growth over revenge. By asking yourself what this minor incident might teach you about patience, acceptance, or the complexity of others' lives, rather than focusing on how inconsiderate the other driver was. When a coworker takes credit for your ideas, you can practice creative rather than reactive thinking by considering how this experience might help you become better at protecting your work, communicating your contributions, or choosing more trustworthy collaborators. When a friend betrays your confidence, you can practice mentalization by exploring the various possible reasons for their behavior, rather than immediately assuming malicious intent and plotting retaliation. When a romantic partner disappoints you, you can practice earned security by distinguishing between this person's limitations and your own worth, between this relationship's problems and your capacity for future love. In each case, the revenge-focused response keeps you psychologically trapped in the immediate pain of the situation. The growth-focused response helps you extract value from difficult experiences and move forward with greater wisdom and effectiveness. This doesn't mean being passive or accepting abuse. Sometimes the most creative response to harmful treatment is to leave the situation, set firm boundaries, or take legal action. But even these protective measures can be motivated by self-care and future prevention rather than by desires to hurt others. The question to ask yourself is not whether someone deserves consequences for their behavior. The question is whether your response serves your own long-term interests and aligns with your values. Sometimes these considerations will lead you to pursue justice through appropriate channels. Sometimes they will lead you to simply remove yourself from harmful situations and focus on building better alternatives. Either way, your primary motivation should be creating the kind of life you actually want to live rather than making others pay for preventing you from living that life. This shift in focus is subtle but profound. It transforms you from someone who is controlled by others' actions to someone who maintains agency over your own development and happiness. The person who has mastered this psychological skill becomes virtually immune to manipulation, emotional blackmail, and other forms of psychological control. Because their happiness and self-worth don't depend on how others treat them, others lose the power to control them through approval, disapproval, or threats. This psychological independence is perhaps the greatest gift you can give yourself and the most powerful protection against future injuries. When you no longer need others to behave in particular ways for you to feel good about yourself, you become free to engage with them from a position of strength rather than desperation. You can offer love without demanding it in return. You can provide help without requiring gratitude. You can engage in conflicts without needing to win. You can face criticism without being devastated. You can experience betrayal without being consumed by revenge. This freedom doesn't make you invulnerable to pain. Human beings are naturally wired for connection, and injuries to important relationships will always hurt. but it does mean that you can experience pain without being controlled by it, feel anger without being consumed by it, and face adversity without being defined by it. The journey to this psychological freedom is long and often difficult. It requires facing uncomfortable truths about human nature, accepting painful realities about fairness and justice, and giving up comforting illusions about control and predictability. But it also leads to a life of genuine meaning, authentic relationships, and sustainable happiness that doesn't depend on circumstances beyond your control. Most importantly, it allows you to make a positive contribution to the world rather than simply adding to the sum total of human suffering. In a world filled with people who are trapped in cycles of revenge and resentment, your choice to transcend these patterns becomes a form of leadership, healing, and hope. The psychology of revenge reveals the fundamental choice that defines human experience. You can remain reactive, letting your life be shaped by what others do to you. Or you can become creative, taking responsibility for your own psychological state and using every experience as fuel for your own development. The revenge fantasy that keeps you awake at night isn't just a temporary emotional reaction, it's a crossroads where you decide what kind of person you want to become and what kind of world you want to help create. Will you contribute to the cycles of hatred and retaliation that cause so much human misery? Or will you help evolve human consciousness toward more wisdom, compassion, and effectiveness? Your individual choice matters more than you might think. Every person who breaks free from the revenge trap contributes to the possibility of a more evolved human culture. Every individual who chooses growth over grievance demonstrates that alternatives to resentment and retaliation are not only possible but superior. The person who wronged you gave you an opportunity, though they didn't intend to. They gave you the chance to discover your own psychological strength, to clarify your values, and to contribute to human evolution by choosing transcendence over revenge. How you use this opportunity is up to you. This is perhaps Nietzsche's most profound insight about human psychology. The choice between revenge and transcendence isn't just a personal decision with individual consequences. It's a choice that affects the entire web of relationships you're part of. When you choose growth over revenge, you contribute to a world where people can move beyond their injuries rather than being defined by them. This choice becomes especially important in our current cultural moment, where social media and political polarization have weaponized ressentiment on a massive scale. Everywhere you look, people are defining themselves by their grievances, building their identities around their injuries, and seeking collective revenge against those they blame for their problems. The result is a culture of victimhood and retaliation, where everyone feels justified in harming others because of how they've been harmed themselves. This creates a downward spiral, where increased awareness of injustice leads not to greater wisdom or compassion, but to more sophisticated forms of revenge and resentment. Breaking free from this cultural pattern requires individuals who are willing to take the more difficult path of self-overcoming, rather than the easier path of blame and retaliation. It requires people who understand that their personal healing and growth matter more than getting back at those who have hurt them. Nietzsche believed that every culture needs individuals who embody higher possibilities for human development. These people serve as examples of what's possible when you transcend the basic drives of revenge, ressentiment, and victim identity. They show others that there's an alternative to being psychologically enslaved by your injuries. You have the opportunity to be one of these individuals. Every time you choose growth over revenge, creation over destruction, self-mastery over victim identity, you demonstrate a more evolved form of human consciousness. You become living proof that people can rise above their circumstances rather than being determined by them. This doesn't make you better than others or give you the right to judge those who remain trapped in revenge cycles. Everyone is fighting battles you know nothing about, carrying injuries you can't see, struggling with psychological patterns that may have served them well in different circumstances. The goal isn't to feel superior to others, but to model a different way of responding to life's inevitable injuries and injustices. As we near the end of our exploration into the psychology of revenge, it's important to acknowledge that transcending ressentiment isn't about becoming emotionless or accepting abuse. Healthy anger can be a powerful force for positive change when it motivates you to protect yourself, set boundaries, and work toward justice. The problem isn't feeling angry when you've been wronged. The problem is getting stuck in anger, letting it define your identity and consume your life energy. The person who has successfully transcended the revenge trap can still feel the full range of human emotions, including anger, hurt, and disappointment when they're treated badly. But these emotions pass through them, rather than taking up permanent residence. They use the energy of these emotions to fuel positive action rather than destructive rumination. They might feel angry about injustice and channel that anger into advocacy work. They might feel hurt by betrayal and use that hurt to develop better judgment about who to trust. They might feel disappointed by someone's behavior and let that disappointment motivate them to surround themselves with people of better character. In every case, they transform the energy of negative emotions into fuel for positive development. This is what Nietzsche meant by the transvaluation of values, the ability to take experiences that seem purely negative and extract positive value from them. It's perhaps the most practical application of his philosophical insights. The psychology of revenge reveals fundamental truths about human nature that extend far beyond individual relationships. It shows us how easily people become psychologically enslaved to their past injuries. It reveals the toxic effects of defining yourself in opposition to others, rather than in terms of your own values and goals. It demonstrates the enormous cost of remaining trapped in victim consciousness rather than embracing personal agency. But it also points toward human possibilities that transcend our basic psychological patterns. It suggests that we can learn to respond to injury with wisdom rather than retaliation, to transform pain into strength, and to create meaning even in the face of suffering and injustice. The choice between revenge and transcendence is ultimately a choice between two different ways of being human. You can remain reactive, letting your life be shaped by what others do to you. Or you can become creative, taking responsibility for your own psychological state and using every experience as raw material for your own development. The revenge fantasy that keeps you awake at night isn't just a temporary emotional reaction. It's a crossroads where you decide what kind of person you want to become. Will you be someone whose happiness depends on other people's suffering? Or will you be someone whose joy comes from their own growth, relationships, and achievements? Your brain will continue to generate revenge thoughts as long as you have memories of being wronged. That's not going to change. What can change is your response to these thoughts. You can feed them with your attention and energy, strengthening the neural pathways that keep you trapped in ressentiment. Or you can observe them without engagement, gradually weakening their hold on your consciousness. The person who wronged you may never face consequences for their actions. They may never apologize, never show remorse, never acknowledge the harm they caused. This is one of life's hardest truths. But your happiness and freedom don't depend on their acknowledgement, punishment, or suffering. Your happiness and freedom depend on your willingness to create a meaningful life, regardless of what others do or don't do. This is the ultimate lesson of Nietzsche's psychology of revenge. The strongest people aren't those who successfully destroy their enemies. The strongest people are those who become too powerful to be significantly harmed by what others do to them. They've developed what we might call psychological immunity, the ability to maintain their center regardless of external circumstances. It's 2 a.m. You're lying in bed, but instead of fantasizing about revenge, you're planning your next creative project. Instead of replaying past injuries, you're visualizing future achievements. Instead of burning with resentment, you're filled with excitement about what you're building. This is what lies on the other side of the revenge trap. Not the satisfaction of seeing your enemies suffer, but the deeper satisfaction of becoming someone who doesn't need enemies to feel powerful. Not the temporary high of payback, but the sustainable joy of a life lived according to your own values and directed toward your own goals. The choice is yours. The moment is now. Your real life begins when you decide to stop being defined by what others have done to you and start being defined by what you choose to do with yourself. Turn away from revenge. Turn toward creation. This is the path to true power. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of one of humanity's most destructive psychological patterns. If these insights have resonated with you, share them with others who might benefit from understanding the hidden costs of revenge and the liberating possibilities of transcendence. Remember that every moment you spend plotting someone else's downfall is a moment you're not investing in your own rise. Your attention is precious. Your energy is limited. Your life is waiting. Choose wisely.